Great. I think I'll get started with an introduction, and people can continue to arrive and introduce themselves in the chat as they wish. So, hello everybody. I'm Rachel Marshall. I'm the Communications and Impact Manager at UCL in the Social Biobehavioral Research Group, and I'm delighted to be supporting the Grace Epi programme. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the series before handing over to our speaker for today. So if you haven't joined one of these events before, then it is part of a programme of work we're running here at UCL with international collaborators in Japan, Chile and Malawi and beyond. And this is a programme called Grace Epi. It's a 7-year programme of work we've just started this year, and it's looking to radically advance epidemiological research on arts and cultural engagement. So we're really excited. We've got a few different work streams looking at conceptual frameworks, extending the epidemiological work to different countries, looking at molecular epidemiological studies, and developing research capacity and new policy internationally. So you can find out more about this on our website if you're interested. But part of this programme is thinking about how we can engaging in open and collaborative science. So this is the reason we wanted to host these free training webinars on a monthly basis. And the aim is to share different methodologies, approaches, and lenses that are relevant to the field of arts and health and epidemiological research. So each month we're inviting different speakers from the universities in the UK and internationally, and hearing from them on their kind of expertise. So you can find other recordings from this webinar series on our website if you'd like to hear other events and other speakers. And if you'd like to hear about future events, you can also subscribe to our newsletter. And actually our next event is scheduled for the 17th of August. And this is with Professor Claudia Libagne, who is going to be speaking to us about participatory practices in the global south, and particularly her experiences working in Brazil. So we're really excited for this one, and you can find all the details of that on our website. And just a final plug to get involved in this webinar series, we'll have a feedback form that we'll share at the end of the event. So if you have any suggestions about the future content or delivery, you can let us know, and we'd really appreciate that. Equally, if you're interested in perhaps presenting your work, then you can get in touch with the email address here or on our website to express your interest in that, and we'd love to hear from you. But without further ado, on to today's session. So during today's session, we're going to be hearing from Professor Luigi Sacco, who's Professor of Behavioral Economics at the Department of Neuroscience and Director of the BACH University Centre at the University of Chieti-Pescara, Italy. So this presentation will be exploring the cultural exposome, which is the totality of cultural, linguistic, creative, and symbolic exposures across the lifespan. And in doing so, we're going to hear a new perspective for environmental medicine and hear that culture is measurable and a biologically active exposure with implications for healthy aging. So we're really excited to hear about this topic on this kind of cutting edge work and research. It will be followed by a Q&A after the presentation. So please do use the Q&A function or the chat to share any comments or questions. We'll endeavour to pick those up at the end, but we're really curious to hear your feedback on this and have a discussion following the presentation. So that's the plan for today. I think without further ado, I will hand over to you, Luigi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to present my work in this environment that I think is probably one of the most stimulating for this kind of research today. The work that I'm going to present is joint work with Daisy Funker from UCL Social Biobehavioral Research Group, and by the way, the principal investigator of Grace Epi, and Agustin Ibanez, who's also part of the research team. It's the first time that we present this research, and in particular this approach to the new notion of cultural exposome, that, as Rachel said, is a way to, I would say, transport a certain type of research about not only the arts, but more generally all kinds of manifestations of human imagination into an environmental medicine perspective. And of course, this immediately brings to the fore some questions about what do we mean by environment in a sense, in this specific sense. And so just to start introducing the topic, I would ask to upload the slides so that you can follow along as I present the various notions. If there is anything that is unclear during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand and to make a question about the specific unclear point during the presentation. Of course, we will defer the actual discussion beyond the technical points for the end of the presentation. Okay, so we said about the exposome as a crucial category in environmental medicine. And generally, when we speak of exposome in a traditional environmental medicine framework, we have a kind of taken for granted assumption that rules everything. And this is that basically there is a sort of direct, linear, and unidirectional relationship between the environment and the organism. It is the environment that affects the organism according to different possible causal pathways, but most of them are threats. Basically, when we speak of exposome, for example, we have in mind pollution, we have in mind social adversity, like, for example, social isolation or loneliness, or specific behavioral patterns that are causing any kind of disease or more generally dysfunctional biological functioning. Like, for example, in a research that I published a few years ago, I showed with some colleagues of mine that even things like obesity can be, in some sense, also characterized, at least partially, in exposomic sense, because on US data, we show that basically there is a sort of a spatial diffusion of obesity, for example, at the US states level, following a pattern that is not very different from that of infectious diseases. So, exposome can be tricky and can be many different things at the same time, but the general assumption is that it's about an environment influencing the organism, mostly in a negative way. What we want to stress with our research is that that's not the only dimension that you have to consider when you want to take a fully, I would say, a full-fledged vision of what the exposome is. So over to the next slide. The point is that humans don't simply inhabit their environment so that the environment influences them. Humans produce their environment. And the interesting thing is that in this production of the environment, there are especially certain types of activity that play a very, very important role. We can characterize them, broadly speaking, as culture. We know that every time we pronounce this word culture, immediately there is a request to define exactly what it is. We cannot really enter this conundrum here, but we can be at least satisfied with listing some of the aspects that we want to consider and that are, I would say, unquestionably related to culture. The problem is maybe to have an exhaustive characterization, but in terms of things that are certainly part of it, there is less controversy. Language, arts, rituals, and symbols are clearly instances of what we mean by culture. They belong to different families because, of course, the arts are different from ritual. And of course, linguistic diversity is related to the arts, is related to symbols, but is a different dimension. But the point is that the combination of all these factors is a combination that is generally produced, maintained, and transmitted by our own biological, in particular, neurobiological systems. The point is that these systems are the very neural systems that basically shape, in a sense, our interaction with the environment. So we have a sort of a circular dynamics here that is particularly important. The multilingual environment is a clear example in this regard. Clearly, we have a multilingual environment if people speak different languages. On the other hand, Once people speak different languages, this, of course, feeds back into the multilingual environment, drives its evolution, and so on and so forth. So what is interesting about this dimension of the exposome is that the exposed are also the exposers. So we cannot really draw a line and say, okay, environment on the left, organism on the right, or the other way around. It's really a circle. And this circle has very, very subtle implications when we consider it overall. Okay, now over to the next slide. So how do we define the cultural exposome? So it's basically the accumulation of all the cultural, linguistic, creative, symbolic exposures across the lifespan. It's a lot of stuff. But even more interesting, this massive exposure has an even more massive biological response pattern elicited by it. So we have to consider the neurobiological, epigenetic, transcriptomic, proteomic, metabolomic responses to the very least. There are even more, but just to fix ideas, this is clearly a big deal in terms of how the environment organismic feedback loops are actually playing out. And interestingly, our thesis is that this constitutes a distinct measurable dimension of the human exposome that is different from the others that have been traditionally listed in environmental medicine. From the linguistic point of view, clearly the number and diversity of languages, it's a primary characterization of the linguistic exposome. And in particular, it's very important to stress that in the individual multilingual competence, and more generally, the population overall linguistic ecology are the crucial features here. We do not tend to think traditionally that speaking different languages or being exposed to a culturally varied, linguistically varied environment should make any particular difference on our health, but think twice. We will see that actually the implications are there. They're quite important. Pretty interestingly, they run in parallel from the logical point of view to the exposure of different kinds of cultural stimuli. For example, the creative or aesthetic ones. So the arts, music, dance, literature, craft, drama, but I mean, you name it. And clearly, this also includes digitally mediated forms. And specifically on this, we will have to return later because clearly this is a big issue that has to be discussed specifically. So the creative aesthetic component of the cultural exposome is also extremely important. And by the way, is the one that has been more thoroughly studied. For example, this recent review that we published with Daisy Fancourt and Argyris Stringaris on Nature Review of Psychology is all about what we call the art exposome. So the specific subcomponent of the cultural exposome in which we find no less than 50 different biological pathways through which the art exposome has effects on human health and well-being. Then there is the symbolic ritualistic part. So the ceremony, rituals, religious practices, we have an impressive literature from bioanthropology that has already detailed the very, very surprising ways in which rituals affect human biological functioning, for example, in terms of synchronization and biological regulation of all kinds of bodily rhythms. The interesting thing is that, okay, it's not only very effective, but literally can be taken together with the linguistic diversity and the creative aesthetic diversity as an integral part of the very specificity of the human exposome. So it's interesting that these new dimensions meet rather naturally what are the standard exposome criteria. They are measurable. Their effect is cumulative. So the more we are exposed to them, the bigger the effect. They are clearly biologically embedded and socially structured. They act along the life course and they are distributed across the population. So there is no specific condition in the traditional exposome definitions that cannot apply naturally to this particular environments. But then the point becomes, what are the main properties of this particular cultural exposome? Over to the next slide. There are four properties here that are generally difficult to frame despite the naturality through which the exposome traditional conditions apply to the cultural exposome. Here we have some particular features that more or less need special consideration. First of all, as I said, there is a sort of expected environment inversion, because in this case, what is the problem? The health problem related to this particular exposome is not exposure, it's lack of exposure. So generally, in exposomic reasoning, we try to limit the exposure to toxic factors of various kinds. Here, we have literally the reverse situation. What is really threatening for our health is lack of exposure to these specific factors. So we literally have to flip the direction of the threat from this point of view. And we are in a situation in which we have to create the conditions for people to be exposed, not to be protected, not to be literally sheltered from this particular kind of exposure. Second, it's a self-generating exposure. As we already said, the exposed organism is also the organism that produces the exposure. So we produce the cultural exposome, and at the same time, we are the ones that, of course, are affected by its actual action or lack of action. Well, now one could say, but if we produce it ourselves, where's the problem? So in some sense, we produce it, we are exposed, and no problem can arise here. Well, it's much less easy than this. As we will see, there are many critical factors that can limit severely our possibility to be exposed to the truly beneficial exposomic factors here. The third aspect is what we could call the recursive co-construction. So it's really a closed loop. We are exposed to the cultural stimuli. Our biology responds to this, and this response further boosts our capacity to generate this favorable exposure. So when the biological response is positive, the biological response itself becomes the precondition for further production of favorable exposomic cultural factors. And finally, the multi-omic intergenerational inscription. This means that these kind of effects typically operate across generations, and they operate across generation through specific molecular pathways. So not unlike what happens in other kinds of more traditional exposomes, we have an intergenerational transmission that is molecularly driven, but in this case specifically relies on mechanisms that need to be investigated more closely. And we will have some quick look at them. Okay, over to the next slide. As we said, the risk here is not toxicity, it's deprivation. Our history with culture is extremely long. We have only rough estimates of how long, for example, symbolic behavior has accompanied human living, but at the very least, it's 100,000 years. So it's a time scale that is compatible with deep biological effects, not maybe super deep or certain types of deep genetic effects, but clearly deep ones. And interestingly, at least some of the members that we have already recruited within the cultural exposome, like languages, music, arts, ritual, are basically human universals. We have no awareness of societies in which these specific manifestations of human intellect and imagination have not been recorded. So basically, this is really something that is ingrained in human nature, whatever reasonable definition of human nature we want to adopt. Um, so, in some sense, this cultural engagement that is so natural for our biology, and not incidentally, we are keeping on discovering new ways in which human biology is affected by this symbolic behavior that sometimes really verge on the surprising to unbelievable, depending on cases, because of course our priors are relatively skeptic in this regard for many reasons. We have been in some sense trained to, I would say, overlook the truly profound biological foundations of cultural engagement. But now, fortunately, the tide is turning from this point of view. As we said, the problem is cultural deprivation. This cultural deprivation literally translates into a scarcity of specific kinds of inputs to the brain, but also to the immune and neuroendocrine systems. What is really interesting is that we think of culture, and even if we want to be very open-minded, we think, okay, culture is good for the brain. Culture is good about imagination, mental health, regulation of emotions, but it's more difficult for many of us to accept the fact that culture has a direct effect on mechanisms that have to do with immune response or neuroendocrine response, which, of course, it's a new ball game that is becoming increasingly well grounded in terms of the latest research. So if we really want to make an analogy with the traditional pathological scenarios in terms of the risk of deprivation, we should think of those illnesses which are really literally caused by a specific deprivation of a nutrient, like scurvy. So in the case of scurvy, the problem is not toxin, the problem is that you don't receive enough vitamin C. So that's basically the same thing. You can consider, in some sense, the cultural exposome as something similar to certain basic nutrients without which our body is not able to function effectively and gets exposed to specific profiles of illnesses. Uh, by the way, a very, very interesting dimension that we are not really able to tackle in detail today for lack of time is how this is paralleling the explosion of interest in microbiome research. Because in some sense, also in terms of microbiome research, we are seeing that certain types of exposure are absolutely fundamental to regulate our microbiota in the first place, but microbiome specifically, the genetic endowment entailed by our gut, and not only gut, but more generally bodily microbial populations. And interestingly, not only we have a logical analogy in terms of exposure, but one of the most interesting aspects that is emerging is that the very microbiota population itself can co-evolve with specific cultural exposomial patterns. So the fact that, for example, we receive certain types of stimuli can even influence and can create a co-occurrence with other newly discovered pathways to biological regulation, like, for example, microbiota communities in ways that only start to be understood today. So, many, many different layers that we have to unscramble. I just note this in passing. I will probably pick it up very briefly later on, but this is probably one of the most exciting future prospects for cultural exposome research. Okay, over to the next slide. So, as I said, we have a logical passage here from the already established notion of a culture of the arts exposome that has been introduced in the already cited review by Daisy Fancourt, Girish Stringaris, and myself, just published, about the mechanistic pathways. The really interesting thing that already emerged at the art exposome level is that you can have, of course, an exposomic dimension at the individual level, of course. You go to concerts, you go to museums, you play music. There are so many different activities that are relevant in this regard. But you also have a community dimension, the fact of being part of a community in which a certain density and diversity of practices, languages, institutions, embeds your specific individual activity makes a huge difference in terms of what kind of exposure you receive. And clearly, even at the larger scale in population terms, for example, the creative diversity, the national linguistic diversity of a country makes a big difference from this point of view. So it's very important in this particular perspective to consider the fact that we are not just reasoning about individual choices and individual habits, but it's really very much about where do you happen to live, do you happen to to be born and to grow up, this makes a huge difference from this point of view. The interesting thing is that the same logic of, let's say, the same cultural exposome logic, interestingly, applies at different scales. It's self-similar, if we want to use the technical term, which means that it has a fractal structure. It has a fascinating self-similar structure from very large scale, from very small scale, which is interesting because it means that, for example, individually interesting solutions can sometimes scale up in good ways, not necessarily at the level of the single individual, but for example, mostly at the level of small groups. This is one of the reasons why, for example, lots of pilot experimentations in small groups that are working today often provide very, very strong inspiration for more ambitious population scale interventions today in terms of the cultural exposure. Okay, over to the next slide. So we have to consider, in terms of the basic underlying mechanism, a self-generating loop that has at least three different poles. So the culture, let's start, for example, from the cultural richness. We already said the environment in which we added in cultural terms makes a big difference in terms of, sorry, there is an interference, makes a big difference in terms of how you react to this kind of stimuli. For the reasons that we have already started to explain, this cultural richness has an effect on biology. So the cultural richness reflects on the biological state. We will have a peek at some of the mechanism in a few minutes. This biological states itself is very important to produce what we consider here human capital. So the development of new skills related to creativity, imagination, knowledge. But if we want to be truly exhaustive, comprehensive in this case, rather than human capital, we should think of the broader and probably more powerful notion of brain capital that is becoming today an overarching new concept to understand how the knowledge and biological dimension are intertwined. So I simply hint at this here, but if you are interested in these topics, stay tuned because we are, as a research group, also developing some new specific vertical in-depth analysis of how the passage from human to brain capital is particularly important here. And so also the notion of knowledge that we have considered basically disembodied for such a long time, for example, in economic growth models, once the biological dimension is factored in, as a completely different profile and particularly opens up very, very interesting new perspectives. So when you develop this level of human and brain capital, of course, this fits back to cultural richness and for sure boosts, of course, the cultural richness, especially if these phenomena are generalized. So in some sense, what is interesting is that we have, when this loop works functionally, we have a cultural environment that is not only rich, but thriving and expanding. Okay, so this is the basic mechanism that we are considering. Over to the next slide, and let's consider some specific results that we already have from the literature. Here, the lead thinker in many of the studies is our friend and co-author Agustin Ibáñez, who has recently published several very, very important studies in terms of the exposomic effects of some specific components of the cultural exposome. For example, this widely cited study on multiculturalism, recently published in 2025, shows that, for example, the country-level share of people speaking additional languages predicts delayed biobehavioral aging, of course, in a dose-dependent way. So this means that the more people are exposed to a multilingual environment, the more their aging slows down. And this is really interesting because, of course, there is no clear mechanistic pathway before the study was published that explains why this should be the case. This is at this moment basically an environmental medicine result. It's an exposomic effect that we can record and statistically prove as relevant. But the point is, what is the underlying mechanism? We are starting to understand this, but in some sense we are midway through from this point of view. I have one specific idea about this, and I am about to publish, in particular, a study that details this for the arts exposome specifically. But I think that in a short time we could probably have a more grounded mechanistic explanation for this kind of effects. Just as a spoiler and as a pointer of interest, my personal speculation on this is that one particular neurobiological framework that is prevailing today, and by the way, is being developed massively at UCL as well, the active inference approach by Carl Friston and co-workers, is probably the most, I would say, appropriate way to explain why these particular effects happen at a mechanistic level. But it's interesting that this particular effect, of course, first of all, shows clearly the inversion effect that I was mentioning before, because in this case, if you are exposed to the diversity of languages, this protects your, for example, capacity to slow down aging. And of course, it's self-generating because you are part of a linguistic community, and so you are literally not simply, as we said, the exposed, but also the exposer. Okay, next slide. Another very important piece of research, in this case from Daisy Frankfurt and co-authors, shows similar effects at the level of cultural engagement. So most properly, the arts exposome that we were mentioning before. So attendance of theaters, museums, galleries, and active creative activity is associated again with the slowing down of physiological aging in many different respects, at a cardiovascular level, respiratory level, and even in terms of metabolic dynamics. Again, the effects here are relatively robust, and they are shown in different dimensions like dementia, depression, chronic pain, and also all-cause mortality. So clearly, again, these are things that cannot be taken lightly in terms of the implication for environmental medicine. But again, we are still lacking this deep mechanistic foundation. So this is something we have to discuss pretty soon in terms of how we can make sense of these particular effects. And over to the next slide. We also have an evidence that in this case is more scattered in the literature in terms of the multi-omic signature. We have early evidence of this, but this is converging at the epigenomic level. We already have, we have a long tradition of studies showing that, for example, early exposure to cultural stimuli in pregnant women has some interesting epigenomic effects, for example, on newly born children. The transcriptomic dimension is less researched at the moment, but this is probably where the big jump, the big step forward will happen in the next 2-3 years. And I will insist in a moment in the one specific transcriptomic mechanism that we have to consider in this regard. At the proteomic level, of course, we have an increased amount of research on the serum signatures of, for example, reduced inflammation or neuroendocrine change. All the research, for example, on cortisol is just the beginning from this point of view. And speaking of proteomics, also in terms of metabolomics, we have an increasing amount of evidence. For example, with my group, we have an early pilot study in which we consider a specific protocol of cultural intervention in which it turns out that pretty significant metabolomic changes can happen also with experiences that last no more than, let's say, 15 hours overall in a few days. And what is really interesting is that these metabolomic changes can stay significant after a couple of months. And they have to do, again, also with things like reduction in oxidative stress. So again, once again, slowing down of aging processes seems to be a common marker in many of these experiences. Over to the next slide. And here we have probably the most important transcriptomic dimension that we want to consider, that is the conserved transcriptomic response to adversity. This has been studied very well in terms, for example, of social isolation and social threats. So, of course, the social threat causes a hyperactivation of the sympathetic system and a norepinephrine spike that through beta adrenergic signaling activates the response in terms of nuclear factor, in terms of interferon regulating factor, that basically, as is typical of this phenomena, causes a jump in inflammatory response and a decrease in antiviral response. That, of course, becomes a very, very serious threat when it becomes permanent. This has been related to long periods of sustained stress, stress that is, in this case, socially produced. And there is, unfortunately, an increasing evidence of the pathogenetic dimension of the action of CTRA. With the cultural exposome, we literally have a new protective factor against this type of response, because cultural engagement, the sense of belonging, purpose, and safety is exactly one way to counter these effects. There has already been research showing that, for example, people who have a more optimistic stance toward life, or people who have rich social connections, people who have a strong sense of purpose, have a better capacity, for example, to counter these particular CTRA-mediated effects. But in particular, the cultural exposome offers us a rich repertoire of resources that do exactly this. So this attenuates the cascade at its very origin, and so offers a regulated immune baseline to work on. Okay, over to the next slide. So this means that once we are starting to consider this wider dimension related to the cultural exposome, we see that there are very interesting parallel converging nodes that can really work together in terms of imagining a new cultural exposome-inspired approach to responses to certain types of health threats. First of all, as we said, so the modulation of the transcriptomic response, of course, the neuroendocrine response, because another aspect that, for example, emerged very clearly from the already cited review by Daisy Fancourt, Stringaris, and myself, is, for example, in terms of the already reported neuroendocrine effects of arts engagement specifically, but also more generally in other cases of cultural engagement. Of course, the cognitive research that is related to the fact that clearly the cultural exposome has also a very, very important dimension in terms of course, of connectivity and not simply maintenance of brain health, but also neuroplasticity that goes, for example, in the direction of thickening certain areas that are related to expert, competent, let's say, approaches to certain types of high-level symbolic and cultural activities. As we said, the microbiome dimension that is largely unexplored from this point of view, and the proteomic metabolomic one. So when we want to really think of future measurement paradigms, we really have to imagine in the fullest formulation this multi-omic dimension as an inevitable way to really measure the effects and understand what are the systemic biological effects of the cultural exposome. This is basically a new kind of science, because specifically in the case of the cultural exposome, we don't have at the moment this level of full-fledged kind of analysis that, of course, can be very expensive outside of well-funded clinical studies. But we think that with the increasing amount of interest that these new perspectives related to culture and the arts in their relationship with health are I would say, commanding all around the world, probably, and I mean, the Grace Epi study itself, from this point of view, can provide an incredibly important contribution to this more general approach. Over to the next slide. As we said, there is a very, very important intergenerational circuit that we have to consider here. So when you are part of a culturally rich environment, as a parent, your physiology is influenced. This, of course, feeds back directly on the development of your own offspring, and the multi-omic calibration of the offspring itself, that of course also impinges upon the cultural capacity of the offspring. We are not really taking a more ambitious transgenerational perspective as we can, for example, adopt it today for other kinds of epigenomic effects that have been studied over the course of many generations. Probably the same is true also in this particular case, but even if we limit ourselves to the intergenerational dimension, the parent-children transmission, we see already that there is lots of stuff happening here that must be studied much more clearly from this point of view. Okay, over to the next slide, because I see that time is running, but we are almost there. What is important to understand is that, as we said, the biological factor of the three factors that we consider, so human capital and cultural richness and human capital have a longer time scale. Cultural richness only changes through generations. Human capital changes through the life course of the single individual. Biological response can change very quickly. So if we consider in particular biological response as the fast variable that reacts very quickly, then the dynamics that is generated is really a dynamic that has to do with interaction, biologically mediated, between the cultural richness and human capital. And we see very clearly that in terms of the explicit dynamical models, we can have here a bistable dynamic, a dynamic in which the cultural richness of the environment is deprived, and not only this acts at the level of the single individuals, but can really create social effects that brings about increasing deprivation and arriving and converging to a degraded equilibrium and a flourishing equilibrium in which the cultural richness becomes and consistently and stably high. There is a tipping point in the middle. This thing is probably exacerbated, as we are seeing today, by the introduction, for example, of artificial intelligence, that in terms of the development, for example, of brain capital and human capital, is creating very, very subtle bistable effects in which people who already have a relatively high level of, for example, cognitive complexity are clearly favored, and their cognition is boosted by the introduction of artificial intelligence. But for people with lower levels, this can really bring about a almost complete deprivation. So this kind of bistable dynamics is probably further exacerbated by the situation that we are facing at the moment. What is even more concerning in this, from this point of view, and over to the next slide, unfortunately, is the fact that there are hysteresis phenomena happening here. If for some reason you witness a collapse in the cultural richness of an environment, even if the external disruption bringing about this collapse is removed, you do not flip back to the original situation. You are, in some sense, in a much worse situation, because once the effect has occurred, it takes an incredibly longer time and a bigger amount of effort to even return to the original situation. And what is happening, for example, in terms of threats to cultural richness in various countries in the world in this moment, for various reasons, political, environmental, and so on and so forth, is a particular room for concern from this point of view. What we have, however, is a window of possible policy action and institutional lag in which interventions still make sense before the hysteresis kicks in. But we really have to consider that certain types of changes, for example, the fact that cultural richness is not often seen as a crucial survival condition for thriving and flourishing of human societies, overlooking this particular dimension, disregarding this, is a particularly acute threat from this point of view. And it's not only in terms of promoting culture itself, but also is in terms of the health effects through the cultural exposome mediation, as we have already discussed. Over to the next slide, so we are close to the conclusion. What are the implications of this paradigm across various fields? So for exposome science and epidemiology, clearly we have a new kind of epidemiology of provision rather than subtraction. We have to create the conditions for people to be exposed. As we said, it should be a no-brainer. I mean, humans create culture, so where is the problem? The problem is that there are, of course, enormous structural barriers for people to be truly exposed. And these barriers, by the way, generally hit more severely people who are more deprived, not only in terms of health, but also in terms, of course, of the economic, social background, social status, and so on. So, of course, this is going to, again, exacerbate already existing inequality. Um, we have to abandon the linear causation approach to exposome science because, as we said, feedback, thresholds, bistability, high hysteresis play a big role. It's extremely important to integrate this heart and health dimension into court surveys and studies, of course, for the reasons that we have just discussed. And clearly, a big problem that we have to face is the problem of cultural deserts. Situations in which people sit in contexts in which they are systematically deprived from this kind of exposure. This has never been really seriously considered as an health issue. We should very urgently start to consider this as such. In terms of One Health and planetary health, of course, cultural diversity becomes literally an ecological health resource. Biocultural diversity and biodiversity, in this sense, co-evolve. So it's not just biodiversity, but also biocultural diversity. And by the way, their interaction, for obvious reasons that I don't have time to discuss. Of course, culture mediates also the access to natural exposome itself, because of course our relationship with nature is today culturally laden itself. So the cultural exposome is not only important in its own right, but also in its relation to the natural exposome. Which again, in positive terms, can be again an exposure that has to do with provision rather than subtraction. And then, of course, all the issues related to climate change and displacement related to climate change and so on and so forth. So in terms of equity, health equity in particular, uh, this kind of inequality related to the cultural exposome can be self-amplified through biology. We don't have to disregard, unfortunately, the effects of colonial disruption that, of course, have been, in this case, truly transgenerational from this point of view in terms of disrupting the cultural exposome. And, of course, the notion, the importance of equalizing access to exposure to cultural stimuli is necessary, is not sufficient, but especially is a priority, also in terms of equity. And so this makes a case for a really right-based approach to the importance of cultural environments. And so just really to conclude, the research agenda that we face at this point is in terms of new measurement, of course, challenges, integrating this research with research on epigenetic clocks, like the already cited research, for example, from Agustini Bagnez and co-authors, the transcriptomic new challenge that is extremely exciting and practically completely new ground, the intergenerational dimensions, the cross-cultural dimensions, the threshold effects that I described, and in particular, whether or not we still have space for action in terms of population level interventions in specific domains, the interaction effects, of course, with the other exposomic factors, like, for example, pollution or social isolation or climate change, and of course, the effect of the digital exposome, which is, in some sense, the elephant in the room, as we said. Okay, just as a bottom line, next slide. So the point is that for us, the exposome is not simply received, but it is produced. There are these four effects that we have discussed: the inversion effect, the self-generation, the recursion, the inscription, which is basically the closed loop of self-generation. This is we think that this can be a foundation of a new approach to exposomic-driven policies that could make some interesting difference also in scaling up what's already being done so positively in terms of promoting the arts through health. And so, last slide. Thank you very much. These are some of the studied. Yeah, we can go to the other slide just to conclude. There are a few selected sources that, if you want, you can dig deeper on some of the aspects that I touched. And of course, now I am ready for your question. And thank you so much for your attention and patience.
Thank you so much for that presentation. And I think you covered so much ground. And I think the argument for addressing cultural deprivation really came through. So thank you. So we do have some time for questions. I know people will be hopefully typing. You can use the Q&A box, or you can also add things into the chat as well. So hopefully there'll be some things coming through there. Thanks also to everybody who introduced themselves. I always find it fascinating. We've got people on the call from Spain, Belgium, the US, UK, South Korea, Romania, and working in lots of different roles, both kind of research on different topics, social prescribing, public health, also people in health clinics, and architects. So I guess I can't see yet questions coming through, but I will start off with a question. Perhaps you talked about some of the kind of implications at the end there, and I wondered if you wanted to expand on if there's particular advice, having done all of this work, that you would give to someone, another researcher perhaps who's working in this field, who wants to draw on this approach. Maybe they are designing their own research project. Is there kind of advice that you would give them on how to kind of take this on board?
Thank you, Rachel. This is a very, very important question. As you see, there is a lot to disentangle here at the conceptual level, on the empirical level. So my personal advice, and this is basically the route that I am myself following at this stage, is go for small pilots where you can control as much as you can many of the confounding factors, because of course, what we have now for this research is a big challenge from clearly and obviously and understandably the clinical environment, and some objections have already been made in terms of saying, okay, but here there are several mechanisms acting at the same time. You cannot really isolate a specific as an effect of culture, a specific effect of the art. How can you disentangle this, for example, from the social interaction itself? Clearly, what is interesting is that the same kind of objections could be applied to so many already established therapies that are part of the clinical toolkit. But the problem is that since this is the newcomer, and clearly it's a bit paradoxical, at least for some people, that the arts or more generally culture can enter this specific toolkit, they tend to be more demanding than they would be for other clinically relevant approaches. So for this reason, working with small pilots with well-controlled interventions and environmental settings can be particularly important to establish some initial credibility. Once you have, let's say, a direct experience with a small pilot, of course, scaling up becomes possible. But at the moment, I think it's better to have a relatively humble approach and really trying to understand in detail this kind of mechanism, the subtleties of administering this. We have to consider that research in this particular field is just a few decades old, and many of these research paths are probably less than 10 years old. So we have to be aware of this.
Thank you very much. And a question from Anna from Vienna. She says, both multilingualism and access to cultural exposition can vary according to social class. To what extent has this been accounted for in research?
This is, Anna, this is an extremely important question. And this, again, is another elephant in the room. Clearly, these effects are important. At least the arts have suffered so much about the fact that, as I said, there was a clear difference in possibility of exposure from people coming from privileged backgrounds and people coming from not so privileged ones. So the real frontier from this point of view is really working with the most fragile populations. So it's also a matter of researchers choosing specific lines of study where you work with this kind of populations to show that, by the way, these are the cases in which the response is likely to be most beneficial, also in health terms. I personally listen to situations in which, for example, there was a presentation of, let's say, the potential beneficial effects of certain types of cultural interventions, and the objection coming, for example, from someone from the health field was, yes, but this of course works for highly educated people. For less educated people, this doesn't work. Well, I couldn't say this more insistently. That's not true. Especially people who are underprivileged tend to respond fantastically well to this kind of stimuli. So it's extremely important to consider that social class makes a big difference here, but especially in terms of exclusion to access of access to opportunity, not in terms of, let's say, exclusionary factors for the actual outcomes of these particular kinds of interventions.
Thank you so much. And another question from Lieve, who says, fantastic new viewpoints. They're curious about the digital exposome. Is this being considered as a toxic or negative exposure?
Well, this is a big question. As you know, there is a heated debate in social psychology. For example, some people say that the systematic exposure to digital media is literally hollowing us out, mentally speaking, and creating a whole new class of diseases, mental health diseases. But the truth is that we don't know. There is evidence. Part of this evidence is, of course, related to specific study designs, and sometimes it's unfortunate to say that researchers sometimes enter this particular field with strong opinion themselves, and this tend to reflect very much in the study design. My personal take on this is that everything is really open in this regard. Clearly, any disruptive technology, and this technology in particular that plugs into so many aspects of human cognition and emotional response, is super influential. But the point is that we have already witnessed so many other examples across the ages of technopanic related to disruptive technologies. And by the way, in many cases, also the biological dimension. Just to make an example, when trains were introduced, there were some physicists that were seriously arguing that traveling by train at, let's say, 70 kilometers, 80 kilometers per hour would have literally disrupted the human body, literally disintegrated, I would say, in a sense. So clearly that was not the case. This is not an argument pro or against. It's simply a remark on the fact that when we tend to make too hasty let's say, considerations about the implication of certain technology, we tend to be tragically off mark. In this specific case, however, there are, of course, many caveats. As I already underlined, we already have, for example, in specific fields like medical diagnosis, in which new studies are coming out basically every week, and now more than once in a week. I mean, the big studies. This tells us that, of course, the disruption here can be huge, also in terms of cognitive complexity and fluency. And for the reasons that we have been discussing with the cultural exposome, this could become a big threat. So we have no idea, but this doesn't mean that we don't have to study intensively now, and especially experiment also with specific measures. And from this point of view, an exposomic perspective like the one outlined here could be also help in terms of designing specific interventions, but also I would say, flagging potential criticalities that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you. And yeah, we had another comment, which I think relates to the point you just made from Natalia, which was saying about this perhaps could have opportunities for intentionally designed digital cultural ecosystems to help support kind of a preventative health environment. So there's some interesting discussion, but I'm conscious we're running out of time for this dedicated webinar. But I see you've left your email on this slide here. Yes. So perhaps if people do want to continue the conversation and reach out following the webinar, then they have that there. Brilliant. Great. Well, I will just wrap up here then. Thank you so much, everybody who has joined this session. We'll be following up over email with some useful links of some of the resources that have been mentioned, and also our upcoming events, and also with our feedback form as well. We'd love to hear any thoughts that you have. But thank you so much for joining today for the rich discussion and for sharing your kind of thoughts and questions in the chat. We're sorry to have to close that there, but thank you so much to Pier, Luigi, for kind of guiding us through the really interesting presentation today and for taking these questions. And we hope to stay in touch and hear more as this work progresses.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks everybody.
Thank you, everybody.